before I get started, there's a lot to cover here, and typically this is quite a long talk. So if you are interested and there's more things I can jump into, please let me know, and I'm more than happy to do that in the panel discussion. But let's get started. Software supply chain threats are real, and as more and more developers and companies rely on open source code that more or less a lot of people can contribute to, maybe not anyone, but a lot of people can contribute to, including, though it's hard to hear, attackers. And this opens a back door, or sometimes a front door, to a vector of attack. And there are increasing supply chain compromises which successfully sneak in new backdoor packages, use typo squatting, like changing the URL so you don't necessarily know what's happening, or even compromising build chain tools, like your CI tool, your CD tools, and signing keys. So what's actually happening in the wild? How do you determine your dependencies and properly secure yourself and your company's software? So we'll first cover some kind of supply chain attacks and when they're likely to happen. And then for developers, we'll discuss what they can do for the dependencies, track metadata, be notified about new security patches that they should apply, including some best practices to make this easier on your own dev team if you're managing a dev team. And this includes not only your dependencies, but also good security hygiene internally. So, just regular, good, safe practices for developing your own software. And this will also include securing scanning for secrets in code. You don't want to include your AWS keys or your Azure tokens or your Google Cloud tokens or your Terraform IDs to have inside your code necessarily. And finally, conducting code reviews. We'll cover also what you should contribute back and how you should report vulnerabilities that you discover. And then lastly, for maintainers, we'll review what security reporting should look like and steps you can take today to increase security and trust. So hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of what you can do for your own supply chain security, for your organization, your entire company, and projects you depend on. So in case you're not looking at my face here on the screen, my name is Brent Beer. I'm a senior solutions engineer over at GitHub. I've been there for about 7.5 years, continually talking to people, open source enthusiasts, maintainers, and companies alike to help them navigate the world of open source, inner source within their company, and how to do everything securely, efficiently, in the best way possible. So I'm always happy to help with what people need to do. So as I mentioned, quick little agenda here. We're going to be covering the software supply chain vulnerabilities. We'll talk about what software supply chain even is, if you're unfamiliar with the term, though you may have your own guesses right there. We'll dive right in and cover some compromises and specifically common attacks that are likely to happen, and with specific examples that have happened in the last few years to understand why these happen at all. So what's a motivating factor for people? And then we'll discuss how to determine your dependencies, track the metadata, be notified about new security patches that you should apply, and all sorts of best practices. So if you're not a developer, of course, maybe put yourself in the mindset to say, I own these products. I am responsible for these developers. I am responsible for my entire company's tech solution. What can I do to help be involved and help know about what's happening? So let's dive in. So what even is a software supply chain? So a software supply chain, as if you're guessing on your own, is anything that goes into or affects your code from development through your CI/CD pipeline until it gets deployed out to production. And maybe why does this matter? I think a lot of times when I talk to people, they might be thinking about maybe just this first line of packages that are involved in their dependencies at the beginning. But it's actually normal for your projects to use hundreds or even thousands of open source dependencies. Of course, you can see a package on that first layer actually relies on many others that may rely on any others. And industry data suggests that anywhere from 85 to 97% of enterprise code bases come from open source. But that, and you depend on that in your own software. So if one of these dependencies has a vulnerability, the chances are you have a vulnerability as well. We'll talk about a specific example of how this might work. Being able to leverage the work of thousands of open source developers means that thousands of strangers effectively have commit access into your production code, which sounds scary. Not trying to make you scared or anything, but it is a little bit of a fear. You need to be more informed, if you're not already, about what this means. So an innocent mistake or a malicious one can attack your supply chain, and it affects you deeply. Now, when you talk about dependencies, what's scary isn't as much as your own internal dependencies that you develop, and hopefully you have controls in place for how internal development is happening between those dependencies. But what's scary is those third-party dependencies externally, like open source code that your developers pull in. Whether or not you know it, you need to continue to remind yourself that that code, a lot of what you're developing internally, proprietary code, involves so much open source work. So of course, there's tools out there. We're going to talk about some tools and best practices to maybe bring down our fear a little bit and be more informed about what we can do. So as mentioned here, every time you pip install, if it's a Python project, go get, if it's a Golang project, or Maven fetch, or anything similar to that, bundle install if you're using Ruby or Java projects with Maven, etc. You're doing the equivalent of plugging a thumb drive that you just found on the sidewalk into your production server. Now, it's just so poignantly correct that when you pull in that extra dependency, you don't know what you're getting. There's tools to give you the investigation, but it's so easy now, which is great. It's so easy to go find that new JavaScript library that you don't have to write for yourself, and you can save some efficient time on your development for your internal product, doing the things for your customers. But it's not really any better doing this than plugging USB you found on the sidewalk into your servers. And we know not to do that. So you should still pull in code from open source, but let's do so safely. So the issue with this, with the software supply chain and doing it securely, is more about the unpatched software. It's not just that you're using open source. Open source is great. We've all been getting the advantages of it. But it's the non-patched open source software that is compromised. Think about it this way. If a component in your code base is open source, and as I mentioned, it's likely that quite a bit is, then any of those dependencies have vulnerability, you're affected. So how can you address that? It's actually estimated that an 85% of vulnerabilities in open source are disclosed with a patch already available. So woohoo, that's good, right? But it's your job to deploy the patch. Now, that sounds easy, just deploy the patch. But you have to be successful in doing this, you have to know what dependencies you use, know about that there's a vulnerability in it, that there's an update, patch the update, and then you get back to work. Now, maybe some people are familiar with different systems out there, like GitHub Dependabot, which I'll talk about in a bit, sending you these constant security vulnerability alerts, sending you the patches and things like that. I think this rings really true for developers, right? Developers and security teams find that patching quite hard. Oh, great, I just patched my version of ESLint yesterday, and now there's a new vulnerability in it today. Why do I have to patch it again? You know what, I'm going to wait on this and do it tomorrow. Or maybe if I don't do it now, someone else will pick it up. So most developers find this hard, and 52%, more than half, right, find it even painful to update vulnerability components. And that's where you should focus. It should be easy, it should be automated. We'll talk about that. And we love talking about software supply chain compromises. They're interesting. So yes, it's hard to do. Let's address that in a minute, but what are they actually trying to do? What are some of these compromises? There's so much to do here, right? You have maybe heard about these compromises, these security, these attacks that have happened in the past, but they're typically in kind of three different components. Who the attacker is, could be a competitor, or someone just trying to mess around, script kiddie, just writing scripts trying to break your software. It's typically how the attack is conducted and what the attack is attempting to do. Now, a supply chain attack in itself isn't typically the end goal, right? No one's trying to compromise, a JavaScript library just to compromise the JavaScript library. It's usually a step further. It's a step towards something else. And almost anyone can conduct such an attack. So we'll focus on how, so what happens to infiltrate your supply chain, and the what, so what are they attempting to get at? Yeah, I think some of these here, just to talk about some of the methods, it might be project takeover if it's an abandoned project. If they can, the vulnerability might be taking over that project, getting access to that package, and then pushing out malicious code to then maybe do something else like Bitcoin mining. Maybe someone's compromising a build tool like Jenkins. So if Jenkins as a CI tool had a vulnerability, or any other open source CI system had a vulnerability, they might be trying to make that CI tool vulnerable so that when the CI tool, the server running the job for your CI, actually gets your source code, now that malicious code could have your source code and go do something with it, right? Maybe that's compromising company IP and leaking company IP. So let's talk about two examples here. One I picked, as I kind of mentioned, was ESLint. And this was an account takeover. So I love this example because it's a software supply chain attack that was trying to make more software supply chain attacks happen. Its end goal was not to attack ESLint. So on the morning of July 12th, 2018, a new version of two components of ESLint were published on NPM. Within an hour of publication, a user filed a bug report against the project, and the malicious packages were unpublished. Great. So all things considered, they were only up for less than 4 hours. A few hours later, however, new uncompromised versions were published. So what happened? A maintainer of ESLint reused their password somewhere else. So the same password that they used to manage ESLint, they used for somewhere else, and they didn't have two-factor authentication enabled. So not a real bad problem in the software itself, but in the way people were behaving with the package. So attackers used credential stuffing to generate authentication tokens for their account, and they started publishing new packages. Malicious versions of ESLint would try to connect to, download, and execute code that was found on Pastebin that captured the npm RC file, which typically is where authentication tokens and for publishing additional packages are stored. So by compromising one npm package, they were hoping to get credentials to compromise a lot more packages. And since this was trying to capture npm credentials, the response to this issue had to be wider than just this package. So npm, taking the appropriate actions here, I believe, revoked all access for tokens generated before the incident. And this includes a lot of private packages. So that's a lot of potential users affected by the cleanup of this incident, even though it was determined later after an investigation that a very small number of packages of users were infected. Now, as much as I want you to automatically update all your dependencies, this is a great example of where that actually would have been bad. For the downstream packages, you should make it as easy as possible to upgrade. But, and I want to highlight this, ideally a human is still involved in the loop, especially if you're publishing a new version of your software after a dependency is updated, using a lock file that forces explicit acknowledgement of any new resources. Now, the other core example here is Webmin. This is a web app for maintaining Unix servers, like those running on Linux or OpenBSD. So that's a lot of the internet. So in August 2019 at DevCon, which is a security conference, typically in Las Vegas, I believe, where a security researcher had disclosed a backdoor allowing unauthenticated remote code execution, or RCE. Now, this backdoor was inserted as part of the build process. So interestingly, the attackers only compromised some of the distribution within valid Webmin and usermin code on GitHub, but backdoored packages were only on SourceForge. The maintainers really didn't clarify how this came to be, and this remained for multiple versions of Webmin, where the backdoored versions were being distributed for over a year, likely with the build servers first being compromised in April of 2018. So a year and some months even earlier. The maintainer even moved to a new build infrastructure in September of 2018 and copied over backups with the backdoor. Thankfully, they were able to fix this issue by rebuilding from source. So starting over, not just copying. The lesson here is build from a checked-in source code on GitHub, not a local directory. Now, of course, this isn't a complete overview. Those two examples are just two that I picked. And you can look that we've been seeing these attacks for a long time, since at least 2015. And there's a lot more examples that we could talk about. So what can you do? We've learned a lot about what software supply chain is, what are the methods, what's the motivation, some examples to maybe put a little bit of fear in you as I keep building up that fear. Gonna drop that down. Hopefully your blood pressure drops a little bit here in a minute. But let's get back to the real issue. What should we focus on? Making patching vulnerabilities easy, automated, and something that happens without any pain. We don't want that 52% of developers finding this painful. Now, I think to improve security of a supply chain, we need multiple sets of users to collaborate. We need to make sure that the tools we have in place work for all users, for developers, which includes your enterprise security teams, maintainers, and finally the security researchers. So let's talk about what each of these groups can actually do to fix this. So a developer on GitHub, of course, I can only speak to what GitHub has here primarily. I feel most confident about doing that. There are several free features, so I'm not going to try to sell you anything. Several free features you can take advantage of to address some of these steps. So there's the dependency graph. This identifies all upstream dependencies and public downstream dependents of your repository package. So if I have one package, it probably brings in a bunch of dependencies, and other people might be depending on what I'm doing. So GitHub compares so GitHub will use this dependency graph to send out vulnerability alerts to notify you of repositories that you have that are affected by a newly discovered vulnerability. So to do this, it takes that graph data and it grabs the information from GitHub's advisory database, which now over 40% and maybe closer to 45% in around December, we saw this big spike in that. 45% of CVEs are issued through GitHub on this advisory database. Dependabot, as an automated alerting bot on top of these, can send this alert and either let you know when a new dependency is found and what you can do, or Dependabot can send a security update to you and open a pull request automatically, which I think takes away a lot of the pain. So I've received my security alert, and then Dependabot's going to go ahead and already open a pull request to propose that change, right? Dependabot is not going to immediately merge that change for us, because if you remember earlier, I said a human should still be involved in the loop. So a human can look at it, you can run CI, see that it passes, double check it, and go ahead and merge that in. So dependency graph, Dependabot, security updates, and those vulnerability alerts are enabled on all public repos by default. You can opt into it in the settings of your repositories for your private repositories. Now, again, if your project is hosted on GitHub, there's a couple of features to make it easier for you. You can create security advisories. These are like private ways to discuss with the rest of your maintainers about a vulnerability found in your project, or a security researcher can find a vulnerability in your project and privately discuss the fix with you. And lastly, if everything is going rosy right now, please, 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 in your projects that are open source, create a security.md file. Do this if you're internal or external, doesn't matter. Create that security.md file, MD being for Markdown here. This will include information on how to contact you, how to report vulnerabilities, and things like that. The number one pain we see today, and why so many of those vulnerabilities are just publicly disclosed, like the webmin one I was talking about, DEF CON, is because the researcher might not know how to contact you to tell you that there's a vulnerability. So they have no other option than to share it with the world. And lastly, for security researchers, we have CodeQL. It's a way, it's a new language that takes your code, treats it as data, and allows you to write queries against it. Now, this is a free tool that you can use for querying vulnerabilities across all open source projects, and then refer to the security metadata file that I was just talking about to report information. So a lot about CodeQL can be read about more at securitylab.github.com, hopefully for more reporters to get involved and create more of that rich security researcher community. So we covered a lot of things today. I think this is the highlight. Inform your developers, let them know about understanding their dependencies, what's in the dependency graph, what's vulnerable, how to fix those as easily as possible. maintainers discussing private ways to do that and how researchers can reach out to them. And finally, how to do proactive searching on your own. And if you want to learn more, there's multiple things here I can keep up on the screen. You can also go to github.com/learn/security to find out kind of overall about some of these free security features. And you can see those github.co links at the bottom for short links for those GitHub features. Thanks.